law enforcement soon began publicly referring to each of the 5 families by the name of its boss at the time.
The irony is that Genovese, in whose name the organization was later named, the inheritor of the great criminal tradition of Lucky Luciano and Frank Costello, did more to destroy that heritage than anybody alive.
In February 1969, Vito Genovese died in prison of heart failure at the age of 72. Now the family needed new leadership and a lower profile. It would soon find a boss who was a master of both. By the time of Vito Genovese's death in 1969, many of the Mafia's most important secrets had been revealed. Now the family that bore his name needed a leader who was a master at hiding his actions. It turned to one of its more colorful characters to fill the bill. Vincent Chin Gigante was best known as the man who had shot mob boss Frank Costello in 1957. After serving 5 years in prison on narcotics charges alongside Genovese, he was released in 1964. He left prison with a better understanding of how the family was run and a promise never to return.
One thing he certainly learned in prison was that he didn't want to go back to prison. He learned to cover his tracks. He learned to be much more careful, much more secretive.
In 1970, Gigante was charged with attempting to bribe the entire police force of Old Tappan, New Jersey. His defense claimed it was all a big misunderstanding.
In November of that year, he gave money to the police force in that city. And his brother said, you know, he's a little bit in need of mental health treatment. He thinks it's getting close to Christmas. You give a tip to the mailman, you give a tip to the garbage collectors. He thought you gave a tip to the policeman, too.
The charges were dropped. Gigante had found an effective strategy for staying out of prison.
To avoid law enforcement scrutiny began what authorities claim is a long act, and very convincing one, of pretending to be crazy, insane on the street, you know, talking to parking meters and dogs and claiming they talk back to him.
One day when the FBI showed up in his house to serve a subpoena on him, they found him in the bathroom, naked in the shower with an umbrella.
It's unclear exactly when Gigante took over as boss of the Genovese family. During much of the 1970s and 80s, the boss was said to be Anthony Fat Tony Salerno. But by the late 1980s, the Chin was clearly in charge.
Believe me, we tried to get the Chin. You couldn't get, he insulated himself so well that you couldn't get to him. He would delegate 10 times removed. He was a smart guy.
Gigante continued to roam the streets of Greenwich Village, looking more like a mental patient than the head of a large criminal empire.
He would usually open commission meetings by apologizing for showing up in pajamas and bathrobe. But he said, you know, I got to keep up appearances.
The New York press eventually caught on to Gigante's act, dubbing him the Odd Father.
There were certain parts of things that just didn't fit. There was the fact that other members of the Genovese crime family were not allowed to speak his name, under the pain of death. They were never allowed to say the Chin. They could refer to him by pointing to their own chin. Now, if you're not the feared boss of a mafia family, why would other feared members of the mafia be afraid to speak your very name?
For more than 2 decades, Vincent Chin Gigante avoided prosecution by pretending to be insane, and he had the medical records to prove it.
Gigante would immediately check himself into some psychiatric hospital or another and always managed to convince at least one psychiatrist that he was crazy. And the government would have to get their psychiatrist, and this went on for years.
Then in 1990, the federal government indicted Gigante on racketeering and murder charges, including a plot to kill rival mob boss John Gotti. For the next 7 years, Gigante's attorneys and the government wrangled over his mental state.
Some people think he's faked it, and he's still faking it. Some people say he faked it, but it actually became true as he got older, and he had strokes, heart attack, and these things can lead to dementia, brain damage.
In 1996, a federal judge declared Gigante competent to stand trial. A jury found the 69-year-old guilty of racketeering in July of 1997 and sentenced him to 12 years in prison. But mob investigators believe that Gigante continues to run the Genovese family from his cell at the Federal Medical Center in Fort Worth, Texas.
The government somehow says Chin Gigante is running the crime family. It's an allegation that's always out there, but it's never been substantiated.
Whatever his current role, Gigante represents a last dying link to the Mafia's golden age, before federal prosecution and infighting reduced its power and influence.
I would say that Vincent Gigante was of the old school. He was the last of the old-time bosses of New York family.
Vincent Gigante was a very, very dedicated man at upholding the oaths of secrecy, the tenets of the Mafia. All the murders that Vincent Gigante was charged with have to do with enforcing the rules of the Mafia. He only killed people when they broke the rules of La Cosa Nostra.
Even with Gigante in prison, the Genoveses remain one of America's most powerful crime families. But the influence of La Cosa Nostra as a whole has diminished over the years. Today's Mafia bears only a passing resemblance to the mob of the past, when powerful bosses like Lucky Luciano, Frank Costello, and Vito Genovese ruled New York City and built an empire through violence and corruption.
We're old-timers. Say it's not like when Lucky was here. Lucky was the guy. Lucky was the man. Lucky knew how to do things. This wouldn't have happened if Lucky was here.
There were no young Italian boys in their teens aspiring to be gangsters. They want to go to universities and get their PhDs and doctorates in the professions.
Ironically enough, an organization that's returning to its roots. It started out as a little street gang, with a couple of young punks like Luciano and Genovese and the rest of them, founded organized crime. And now it's going back. It's basically a street gang, just as it started out.
For the web's best bios, log on to biography.com.